Anything said on Hillbilly Broadcast should be taken only as opinion. Also, the views and opinions expressed by guests of the program that we interview do not necessarily reflect the views of the hosts of Hillbilly Broadcasts or its advertisers. Today's guest is Naomi Wright. She is a founder and member of the board of directors for a group called BeEmboldened. Now, BeEmboldened, according to the About section on their website, says that their mission is to provide support in the prevention of and healing from harmful religious experiences. And I will read the bio for Naomi off of there. It says, Naomi is both passionate and committed to creating change in the areas of religious abuse and cults. She holds a Master of Science in Social Work from the University at Buffalo and is closing in on a Master of Arts in Christian Studies from Denver Seminary. Her resume includes years of focus in grief and loss, as well as the duties of COO for a medium-sized company. She's over the moon to be bringing all of these pieces together alongside her personal story into her role as the founder/executive director of BeEmboldened. So without further delay, here is my conversation with Naomi Wright. So, tell me a little bit about BeEmboldened. Like, what is it? And you started this thing, right?
Yeah, so I founded it back in 2000, and I started it really based on just this feeling of like, I had hidden my story for so long, even from people like I had baby pictures with who had not been a part of the group I had been raised in, because I did go to public school and things like that. So I had friends who were outside of the group, and I had spent forever, filtering so much of my life and what I would share with people. And I just had this sense in the year 2000 finally of like, I just really need to share like what God's done in my life because my life had changed so drastically. And so just to kind of come forward and share more about that. And I had also still had this sense of like duplicity of, okay, like I've healed from a good amount of stuff. Now that I'm like done, I don't think we arrive at like full healing on this side of Jesus's return, or us being in glory with him. But like I've gone through so much of that processing, and yet I haven't like integrated it all because I still pretend none of it happened when I'm talking to people. Like I still never reference anything or anything like that. So I'm like, I still feel like I'm living that out in a way. And I'm like, this just isn't healthy. It's not sustainable. I don't like it. Um, so I decided, okay, like, yeah, I'm gonna come forward and I'm gonna share. And it definitely doesn't look like that for everybody, nor should it look like that for everyone. But that's really what felt right to me was, okay, I'm gonna create this video on YouTube and I guess I'll start blogging. I didn't really know what I was doing, honestly. It was just like, okay, I'm gonna just share what God's done for me. And I don't know what's gonna come from there. And as I got started, then just more and more kind of had more and more vision. I don't mean that in a spiritual way, just like more and more ideas, like as a visionary and kind of dreams of like what it could be and how we could serve. And so started adding different services and things like that. And we still have so much that we want to do. I have at least the next 5 years, if not 20, of ideas with how long stuff really takes to come to fruition. But yeah, so that's kind of how it got going. And I had to reach out to people before I even made that YouTube video because I'm like, well, I don't want people I have had those baby photos with to find out on YouTube. So, like, I've got to call some people, and there's some people still in the group too that, out of respect for the relationship that we at least had, whether or not we would be able to have one going forward, depending on what choice they would make because of the choice I was making, I wanted to give them a heads up too, to let them know that I was going to be sharing more publicly. I knew that would be a really big deal for them.
Yeah. So, what was your background? Like, what did you, I mean, in as much as you're able to say, was it one of these high control uh, groups, or was, because I think I'd heard a little bit about it, but, obviously we come from me, my wife, and some of the others on the podcast, we come from the CHM, Conservative Holiness Movement. But so give me a little bit about what you came from in regards to this.
Sure. So, definitely a high control group. I was raised being told that I was Christian, like, the true Israelite, small remnant, all of that kind of stuff that is pretty common for people in these higher control, like elitist groups to be told. And it was an extreme splinter of the message. William Branham was the founder of that. I don't know if that would sound familiar
Yeah,
to
I've heard that
anyone.
name. Yeah.
Okay. And so yeah, he was big. He was big for like sort of the hyper charismatic movement in general. So there's some connections to like the new apostolic reformation now. So he's kind of headed in these different directions. He died in a car accident back in 65. So he's been gone for a long time, but unfortunately such legacies can carry on and
Mm-hmm.
ruin lives for many generations.
Absolutely.
And my dad had been acquainted with the message in different ways. He had also sang in a couple of the like tent revival meetings, is my understanding, because he was a singer, and from there kind of felt that he was like carrying the torch on after Brenham died in that car accident, as many thought that they did, in retrospect, now that we know more of that history. And he wanted to bring in polygamy though, and engage in that practice. And he believes that that was something that he was at least permitted to do. It was not a requirement in the group, but it was definitely permissible. And that got him kicked out of the message. So anyone that he was trying to still connect with who was in the message, they were like, no, like we don't support this. And it's not that no other message groups did at any point, but it definitely where he was going and all that, that was not going to be acceptable. So he then went off on his own.
So the message, you said other groups that split off, there had been other groups that had embraced polygamy?
So I've been told that there have been. I don't know exactly what that like climate looks like now because the message is still ongoing and it is international. I think the estimate I've heard, I don't know really what it's based on. I know how accurate it is, but between 2 and 4 million people worldwide, so it's big.
Wow.
Yeah, it's particularly big in certain areas of the world. But so I have been told that yes, some other like subsets, ended up taking it up, but what my dad did then was he spent 5 years on his own kind of studying, which is not recommended. I know that after we've experienced spiritual abuse in the ways that many of us have, we want to isolate, and there can be pros to that, there can be cons to that over time. A con for my dad was he spent 5 years alone studying the Bible. There were no checks and balances, and so just whatever was coming to his head,
Oh,
was
yeah.
then God speaking to him. And we see that in churches where the person isn't alone and isolated,
Sure.
and everything can be over spiritualized, and we never just have our own thought. It's always being plopped there by the Lord, which isn't necessarily the case. And so there wasn't any discernment ultimately. So he ended up gathering up a following. So this is what I was raised in. Most people were homeschooled, which is helpful for high control. By no means is everyone who's homeschooled in a high control group at all. It's just something that is helpful for a group that does have high control because there's less oversight of what's going on, with the family and with the children. My brother and I were pretty rare though, because we went to public school because our mom worked full time, and that was for financial reasons. And so that's where that duplicitous thing came in of like, I'm going to school, and we had the holiness standards as well. That's an overlap that you and I certainly have.
Okay.
So, I mean, I had the uncut hair that was to the back of my knees, and I couldn't, no makeup, no jewelry, which I'm good with no makeup now anyway, but it's a pain to put on. But no makeup, no jewelry, and everything had like a spiritual connection. Like if I got my ears pierced, it would signify that I didn't want to hear the word of the Lord. So there were all these kind of connections for things. And we didn't celebrate any holidays. Birthdays were intermittent once in a while. Like there might be something like as teenagers, we did get to choose a restaurant and go to dinner. But yeah, the only holiday otherwise that we celebrated was Thanksgiving. And I semi-jokingly say it's because my dad loved to eat, but I really think that that's what it was about. Was he loved a good meal. But that was the exception was Thanksgiving.
Now, what was the reason for no holidays?
Because they were supposedly pagan.
Ah,
Yeah, the pagan thing, those pagan roots, and so we weren't supposed to participate. Everything was like worldly, like if generally culture was doing something, then us being in the world and not of it meant that we just didn't do any of it. And it's like, well, that doesn't work because we still need to eat and we still need, there's lots
Yeah.
of things that the world does that we
Yeah.
still do. And so just things being taken out of context. So that's kind of like overall, again, there was a polygamous aspect. There were other theological issues for sure. Like I was taught that my parents could not and would not die, that like their generation and everyone below them would walk into the new heavens and the new earth together. So when my dad died when I was 21 and then my mom died at 25, I mean, that wrecked me.
Yep.
And that was the start of how I got out because those were threads that were pulled that like you just can't easily reconcile. Now, some people did because the group is ongoing, but I just knew I'm like I've got to look into this more. What else is wrong?
Yeah, that seems like a big deal to make that claim, and then when that claim doesn't come true, that's that one. I would definitely have a hard time reconciling with that.
Right, kinda like the rapture dates, right? Where
Yes,
it's
I
like,
was just
"Oh, this
thinking
is when
about
it's
that.
gonna happen." Yeah, it's like, "Well, it didn't, so now what do we do?" "Well, we pivot." Like,
Yeah.
that's a tough pivot.
Who was the guy who wrote the book in '88? I can't ever remember his name, but 88 Reasons Why the Lord's Coming Back in '88 or whatever it was. And then, of course, we all know what happened.
Mm,
But
right.
and even just recently, it seemed like this stuff's getting. I don't know if it's getting more power or what, but this eclipse happened. All these people going berserk, and
Yes.
before that, you had like what, 4 blood moons. You had all this. That it's like, when do these guys when do they stop losing their power over people with all
Yeah.
these false?
Pandemic.
Yeah.
That was a big one.
Oh yeah, that was another big one
Mhm.
for sure. Now let's talk. Let's talk some more then about your organization. So, Be Emboldened, you guys work with a specific group of people. Like, as far as, is it focused towards people that come out of stuff like the CHM or the what was the term for what you were in? I know you said it was a subset of the message, but did they have a name for it?
No, I was just told I was Christian, which got real confusing in public school when people asked.
Well, same thing with us, because we just called ourselves Holiness. And
Okay.
that got confusing because there was other Pentecostals running around here, and we thought the Pentecostals were of the devil.
Oh, right.
And so you had to be very careful
Yeah.
when you told somebody I go to a holiness church, because they're like, oh, yeah. So
Mhm.
you work with people that come out of high control groups.
Yes, not exclusively. We work with people who have well, on the preventative side too, but talking about, like, the healing and rebuilding side of things specifically right now, people who have come out of a spiritually abusive environment, period. So oftentimes there's a high control element. It's not always necessarily high control, at least like the whole environment, because it can be mainstream churches where something has gone wrong that shouldn't have happened. So there is kind of a spectrum to it, and like the context can look a little bit differently. So I would spread it a bit wider as far as who we come alongside. I see a lot of holiness movement people though. And I think a part of that is our connection, our relationship with Berean holiness
Mm-hmm.
and what, Natalie and them are doing, what people like you are doing. And I'm so thankful for these relationships because it helps us to kind of partner together in different
Yeah.
ways to get people the help that they need, depending on who's offering what service.
I sit and talk with Nick Lavender sometimes from Beyond the Vow, and I've told him, it's like, it feels like that there's almost this coalition of people now that are exposing the same general
Mhm.
stuff, and we're all kind of pulling in the same direction. I'm really glad to see it. You said that it's not always high control, and sometimes it's easy for me to forget about that, because that's what I'm looking at as the CHM or high control groups, and that's what I experienced. But then all of a sudden, like the Mark Driscoll podcast or something will hit, the
Right.
whole Mars Hill situation, and you realize it's not just people that look a little bit like Amish or just dress weird or whatever. Like, this stuff can happen in full on mainstream churches as well.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And so you're right, like there still is that high control element because Mars Hill was like a highly controlled situation in so many ways, but not how we might necessarily think about it for those of us who have come from more of a cult-ish kind of background, like the holiness standard stuff, or I definitely constitute what I came out of as a cult. I mean, it just checks all the boxes from any definition that someone wants to use, but that's not always the case. So sometimes because of my story, people can think, "Oh, Be Emboldened helps people who have come out of cults," and that's true. It's just not exclusively people who have come out of cults.
Okay, very good. I don't know why I thought about this, but I've been thinking about, since we mentioned the Mars Hill thing and all that, and you see Mark Driscoll like still around. In fact, he just made the news here
Mhm.
recently because of that men's conference. If you've got somebody, whether this be mainstream or or more cult-like groups like we were accustomed to, whatever. If you have somebody that like mishandled things so bad, can you ever really give them the space again to like? Can you ever really put your trust? I guess what I'm asking: do people change
Mhm.
that
Hmm.
are in the higher ups of these groups, or do you just kind of like look at them crossways? From then on.
Yeah. Gosh, that question gets me a little bit because I mean this, it has been a deep privilege. Like, it's just the coolest thing in the world. I've been able to meet and BeEmboldened's been able to serve people who used to be leaders in some of these organizations, and they have genuinely recognized how messed up it was, and they are genuinely repentant. And their biggest struggle, honestly, is receiving that they could be forgiven because they just are really struggling to forgive themselves. And a lot of this, it's like generational, you know? So it's like, well, they were raised in it because their parents were in it. And so, and I recently was speaking with someone who was the head of an organization. So it wasn't a church, it was like a parachurch organization, kind of like Be Emboldened, like that idea of that structure. Definitely not same services, but, and he was so honest with everyone publicly about how he had sought to cover his own tail, how he like all of these things that he had done wrong. And it's so real. And so we do see that. It's nowhere near as common as I would like it to be. But yes, people do recognize and they do step away. When I think about someone like Mark Driscoll and just the behavior we've seen, using him as an example, we haven't seen what I'm talking about though. Like, we haven't seen that devastated person because they're recognizing how their influence has devastated other people. Like, we're not seeing that. And we're also seeing someone who's like seeking out influence and power again. When someone's seeking out power and influence, and like that seems to be the goal, that's a concern.
Yeah, that always gives me
It's
weird vibes.
different. Yeah, it's different when someone's like, "I'm just doing what I've got in me to do, what I've got the skill set to do, what I've got the heart to do." Like, when someone's like, "I'm just doing what I've got available to offer and do," and if they end up with some influence, like, that's a different thing than seeking the influence first. And I see the problematic version with what I know of Mark Driscoll and the transition he made to the new church a while back, as in comparison to what I'm seeing again from different leaders that we've been able to come alongside and serve. Where I don't even know if I mean, it would probably take a lot for them to even decide to step back into ministry because they would be so worried and probably distrustful of themselves. And so there's a lot of rebuilding in who they are and in their identity in Christ, and the fact that they can, they can receive forgiveness and they can go and apologize to everyone. I think that's really huge too, is we need our apology to be at the same level as the abuse. So, like, if Mark Driscoll was abusive and it reached far and wide, especially because all of his stuff was recorded and being listened to, and it's like that apology and that ownership also needs to reach far and wide. So, like, that would need it because we need to reach as many people that potentially heard what was damaging. So, like, we want to like try to get it out there.
Yeah.
So as many people that heard the damaging stuff can hear the rectifying stuff. And that doesn't mean we don't have those one-on-one conversations or group conversations or things like that either. But my goodness, I mean, gosh, if I think back to my experience, what I was raised in, like, yeah, I didn't treat people right. I'm like, I was pretty harsh, like legalistic, like in my thinking towards
Oh yeah, I
people.
was the same way. Absolutely.
Right. And I mean, we came by it honestly. But if there's anyone that I could think of specifically or where I could reach back, and I've had that as I've, grown out of it, where I'm like, gosh, if I had a way of reaching that person, or there's some people I could reach. And so I did just write a letter because like, I don't want to put them on the spot necessarily, but I want to reach out and be like, gosh, I would have done that so differently. And I'm so sorry. And if you would ever want to talk about it or anything like I would be here, but absolutely no pressure. So just I think us having a heart posture of being able to own that humility, that accountability. Um, Even though, again, I knew I came by it honestly. It wasn't totally my fault, but I also still did it. So you hear that kind of both and.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I
Yeah,
used to
that
do the
can be
same thing. I
tricky.
mean, there's sometimes I look back on it now and I'm still, like, still ashamed of, like, the even not even the stuff that I said to people. I mean, I'm sure there are those instances as well, but just the way I thought about people. Like,
Mhm.
just that whole thing of remembering, "Oh, man, here's how you used to, like, if, how you used to look at people in Walmart and just judge them as, like, "Man, everybody in here going
Yeah.
to hell." You just that whole thing. With Mark, I almost got sucked into that whole thing when he was at Mars
Mhm.
Hill. No, it was afterwards, actually. Before I heard everything about it, I kind of, I followed him pretty closely for a while
Mhm.
and listened to a lot of his sermons and all that. And it seems that, well, tell me if you see this. If somebody comes out of one mess, do they have a more likelihood of being influenced into something else?
Oh, 100%. Yes. Yeah. And that's where in our mission statement, I have in there like victimization and re-victimization because, well, and I hold to certain ideas too with this knowledge that re-victimization is prevalent and we do have a higher risk. Let me couch it in this though. We have a higher risk until we really get our feet under us. Then I think it's gonna be way harder to recruit you or recruit me into something. I think it'd be way harder now than it would have been like when we were just leaving.
I see.
Because when we were just leaving, we haven't made sense of like what exactly all that was yet, what actually aligned with the Bible versus what didn't, what's actually okay with like we haven't had the time to do all that mental and emotional processing and figure it out, make sense of it, and to kind of know, okay, what's my foundation moving forward? So during that period, we're definitely more at risk for re-victimization. And that's why I actually caution people who come to be emboldened and they've been told like, hey, I just keep getting told like I just need to get back into church. I just need to do this and do that. And I'm like, I get that it's well intentioned, but if you're not sure how to even identify a healthy, sound church, then I would tell you to hold on a minute because you could wind up in something else like and have no idea what you're getting into. So like let's talk some of this through and be emboldened. Our approach is we're not teaching specific doctrine. It's not like we're not choosing on like secondary, tertiary issues. It's like here's all the options that scripture gives you. Like here's what's within the bounds. And then like you get to pick. And you and I, Phil, may not agree on things, and that's fine. That's where the unity piece comes in. So, and scripture talks about that unity. And unity is not hard if we all agree on everything. Unity is hard when we don't, but it's like, okay, we don't have to agree on all this stuff. So here's all your options. We got 4 to 6 end time views. You can pick whichever one you want.
Yep.
So, and so that's our approach to it. And sometimes with people, we're not even able to. We don't even talk about the Bible for a while. It's like it's not even going to be a part of our conversations because there people can be so triggered by the Bible, like they're really like they can't. And I mean triggered in like a real sense of the word, like someone's coming out of their skin and they're like, I'm so shut down and through the roof right now that like I can't even hear what you're saying to process it. Well, that's not going to be helpful for anybody and it's not healthy. So I'll actually I'll probably get some slack from this out there, in the Christian world, but please don't just jump into another church right away because you are more likely to be re-victimized. And if you are dissociating, we don't want to encourage that behavior. It's understandable you're doing it, but we want to step it back so that you're not having to dissociate when you go in because that's not a healthy response long term. We'd have some other mental health concerns if that continued for an extended period of time. So yeah, all of that being taken together, revictimization is definitely a higher risk during that period while people are getting their feet under them. And so if you're anyone out there who's listening and you're like, I've been really like struggling, but making myself go every Sunday and every Wednesday and all the things, and I am just really having a hard time, it's okay to have a season where you don't. Honestly, for me, I wasn't able to regularly attend a church for an extended period of time for like 10 years. It took me a really long time.
Hmm.
And it's okay. Like, I still had a relationship with God. I wanted to be able to attend a church. I wanted to be able to have a sense of community, but there was a lot of stuff going on with me where like it was so unsafe that I just couldn't. And so it's taken time. Now I can, and I'm grateful for it. I'm glad that I'm able to, but it took me a long time to get here.
Yeah. I remember, I think the first time that I heard that really expressed, it was Jen from Amateur Faith Night. She wrote a book, and she had me to read through it and write a little blurb for the front of it. And I remember reading in her book, she basically said the same thing that you did. And I think it's the first time I'd really heard somebody just flat out say it. Because in my mind, don't get me wrong, there's still sometimes I still yet, Sunday morning rolls around, and you're like, but you still got this guilt complex because, man, the whip was cracked all those years of,
Oh, yeah.
forsake not the gathering together of yourselves, and even so more as the day approaches, so, that, and of course, that was tied together with end times. And in other words, y'all better be at church 3 times a week. So
Mhm.
that really does me good to hear you say that. And I think that'll be helpful for people as well, just that it's not a bad thing to take some time to figure some stuff out.
Yeah, it's not necessarily a bad thing either. I would add to it, like, I would say it could be a bad thing to not. I would actually flip it because again, if you're not sure why all that was a problem and you're figuring out what a solid church looks like, and or you're having some, health stuff like mental health stuff going on, like crazy anxiety or depression or like I said, the dissociative coping mechanism that a lot of us can default to, it's actually going to cause you a lot more problems, and it's going to make a longer process for you. So for those of you where maybe that's been the case, you go ahead and make a change now. Like it's never too late. But yeah, I would actually go further. And again, I've gotten some slack for that, and I get it because it doesn't sound good. And I'm also
Sure.
not saying to isolate because when we've experienced a trauma happens in a relationship. Like trauma happens with at least two people. And a narrative is created from that. Like if I come out of a church experience where it was abusive, I could then think, okay, well, I'm stepping into another environment that looks really similar to that last environment. And I could believe like, okay, well, now all churches are abusive, or I could, kind of head in that direction. I can know logically, okay, that's probably not true, but I'm not going to actually trust that it's not true because that's what I've known. So we do need what's called a corrective experience. And for all y'all who have come out of a very high discipline group, I don't mean that in a disciplinarian way. It just means different from the narrative you've already gotten of like churches are abusive. We have to actually experience that people aren't abusive in order to really deeply believe that it can be different. And that doesn't have to be like on a whole church scale. That could be meeting with a support person or having one good friend that you're chatting with and you're connecting with, but starting to see like, okay, I can have good trusted relationships. Like people can actually show up for me. People can make a mistake and actually apologize and take ownership. Like, okay, I'm seeing that these things are real possibilities. I'm seeing that people can be okay with asking questions. I'm seeing that people will say, I don't know, let's look for the answer together if they don't have the answer instead of like having to know it all and they make it up. Like all these things that we've run into before, we can have the opportunity to see, okay, it can actually be different. We don't get that opportunity if we totally isolate for an extended period of time. So at some point, again, I love coming alongside people and kind of helping them that through that process of, okay, and sometimes it's literally in the therapeutic relationship where it's like, okay, this is safe. This is a place where I can say what I need to say. I know it's not going anywhere. I know it's confidential. So that's great. And I could sue them if I want to, if they don't maintain that.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, great.
Yeah,
It gives you
absolutely.
some assurance. But yeah, it can be a starting point. It doesn't have to be. But for some people it is because it's what feels the safest.
I think you hit some on the answer to this question here. When it comes to being able to identify a healthy church, when we've hit that point, we feel like, okay, it's time for me to start looking again and start getting back into
Mhm.
a body of believers. And I think you mentioned some things there in your last answer that elaborated on this a little. But if you could, can you give me a general guideline? Give our listeners general, like when you say a healthy church versus. Now I'm guessing we know what an unhealthy one was. A lot of us that listen because we came from that. But what are some things for us to look for as we navigate this whole spiritual walk and try to get into a more healthy place?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of my top ones. Uh, there's a lot of things that we can look for. There's quite a few that I would probably ultimately list out, as well as some ways for you to go about getting that information, and even some good questions to ask leadership before you really get involved. If you're able to get to the point of having a conversation with someone, but a couple things that I think are really important as early on as possible. One, to find out it's called polity, and you're talking about, like, how the church is structured. So, is it, like, one central figure? And I'm sure you know where I'm going with that.
Oh, yeah. Yep. Saw that a
Do
lot.
we have right? Do we have an elder board? If so, is it just all the yes men besties? Like, I mean, who's on it?
Saw that a lot too.
Yeah, uh-huh. And so that's really important. Okay? Like, what is the actual leadership structure and who makes it up? And do we have some idea of, okay, this is real accountability? I'm looking for leadership who takes James 3:1 really seriously, which is that part about being held to a higher level of accountability when we're influencing others. So when we're in a place of leadership, I want someone who takes that so seriously that they have some healthy fear of the Lord, not all the fear of the Lord that we were taught. That is not true, but some just
Yeah.
healthy of like, ooh, I will probably stand before Jesus someday if I've led everyone astray. Let me take that seriously, make sure I don't go rogue. If I do, they're going to catch it. They're going to deceive me. They're going to get me out of there so that everybody is actually okay before I harm them. Like, that's what I want to see in leadership. So that's my number one. That's the first thing I'm looking for is the structure. And then something else that I care about, and obviously I'm going to be biased on this one because of the area that what I've experienced, because I then went on to have different experiences within mainstream church too, within an organization my husband worked for that was a Christian organization. So I've sort of had like a buffet of it, not just the cult upbringing. And so looking at all of that and just recognizing how prevalent this is and knowing how little it's still being talked about in comparison to its prevalence, like it's way more prevalent than it is being addressed, especially in the churches. Um, and that's a generalization. There are churches doing really good things, but overall, so with that in mind and hearing different kind of stuff I've heard, like spiritual abuse, oh, they've just been convicted and they don't like that feeling. Um, I wanna know what they actually believe about spiritual abuse. So I wanna know, do you guys think it's real? How do you address it? Do you have policies and procedures for it? Like, do you have a whistleblower protection like, I wanna know about that kind of stuff,
Mm.
and it doesn't have to be spiritual abuse specific, it could be any kind of abuse that maybe would happen. Well, let me put it this way. If abuse happens at a church, there's always a spiritual abuse component by default because it's happening in a church. There can be other kinds of abuses, of course, that happen within that spiritual framework, physical, sexual, etc. So, and it's not always happening in the church. It can be happening in homes. It happens in mission organizations. It happens in prayer church organizations. But anytime there's a spiritual overtone of it, that inevitably is happening because we're connecting it with our salvation, our right standing with the Lord, like sin, all that kind of stuff. So it's really important. So that's another thing that matters a lot to me. I also really appreciate a level of transparency from the organization. So, like, are they gonna will they sit down and meet with me? I get people are busy, but like, can I sit down and have a conversation with someone? Can I ask my questions? What's sort of the demeanor of the response I'm getting? Like, what's the tone? Those verbal and nonverbal cues. I'm looking for that sense of humility. I'm looking for questions being encouraged. I'm looking for, periods of doubt being considered reasonable and we walk through those together. I'm looking for character, which that one's tough, you guys. That one can be tough to discern super early on. So even when we find a church where we're like, okay, this is solid. And also, of course, we're wanting to make sure doctrine's good. I'm looking for that just on the website before I ever walk in.
Mm.
I'm reading the statement of faith. I'm reading the mission and vision. I'm listening to some sermons. I want to hear like what they're teaching, particularly if I go through and I see, like if I saw a series on forgiveness, I would totally watch that one. If I saw, anything where it's like, oh, that tends to be like a manipulated area, like I'm going to play those ones specifically. So I'm going to do some spot checking
Yeah.
before I even walk in. So like lowest risk possible. Like walking in is going to feel way higher risk. So like get anything you can just on social media, on the internet, on their website first. And then if you get to the point of, okay, now I'm ready to like actually step in the doors. Am I being loved bombed? Is it tense? Like what's the feeling in this environment? And yeah, going on from there, like I said, I move into like, I want to have a conversation with leadership. I have a series of 5 questions that I would typically ask that I want to check in with them on. Another area that can really matter is financial. So I don't know who has maybe experienced financial exploitation or financial abuse as a part of their spiritual abuse, but that can very easily go hand in hand
Sure
in
can.
these stories.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like the heavy giving, that can be connected to your right standing with the Lord as well. And it's not the generosity talk that we should be having. It's that you got to give this percentage and then you got to give more and this is going to earn you cred and this is going to do all these things and right. And so
Oh, yeah.
I've got questions about that before I'm going to get involved.
Yeah.
So some of those hot points, I'd encourage all of you, anyone who's listening, think about what are those like hot points for you from the experiences you've had before? How can you phrase that as a question? And then seek an answer to that question. Again, you might be able to just get it off a website by listening to some sermons. If you know anyone that goes there, you might be able to get it through email. It might be something where you attend. It might be something where you have a sit down with somebody. But I'd encourage you, get those answers. Your questions are valid. They're important. You have them for a reason. So seek the answers to them. And if you have follow-up questions based on the answer, like one of the kind of examples that I think about is, okay, if say I asked to see the financials of a church, because it's an organization where like I can. So just so all of y'all know, you can ask to see financials of the church. So if you ask to see them and you get to look at them and you're like, wow, like some of these costs look really crazy. I'm going to have a sense of humility of I have no idea what it costs to get enough toilet paper for 4 nights a week for 500 people. So like I might have some follow-up questions. I'm going to have some humility in it because I might just not get how high all of this how it adds up. But I'm going to have some questions about things depending on what I'm seeing. And it's really going to matter to me, again, the approach, the conversation. It needs to actually be biblical. And if I'm being taught I have to give 10% to the church and otherwise my salvation's at stake, that is unbiblical. And so that's not going to be an agree to disagree situation.
Sure. Well, Naomi, I don't want to hold you up. I appreciate very much what you're doing, and you've given us a lot of information today. I hope that people can learn from, and definitely I'll use some of this as well. Where can people find y'all at?
Yeah, people are welcome to, of course, you can follow on social media and all that, but our website's the best place to start because it'll link you to everything else. If you then want to find us on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok when I feel like it, not so much on there. I don't really know what's happening with that anyway. But yeah, and then we're on YouTube. All of our podcasts and live streams we throw up on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts, wherever you're listening to Phil today. You can probably find us. So go to BeEmboldened.com. So it's BE and then emboldened.com. And again, it can link you to anything from there. But yeah, we've got some great resources that I just really stand by. Particularly we have, I don't know when this will release, Phil, but our next round of our Rebuilding After Religious Abuse digital course is registrations opening the first week of June. I think it actually opens May 31st. There's also going to be a webinar where you'll get a discount code. So if you see the date for that, if you can't make it, we send it out in an email afterwards to anyone who subscribes. So you can just subscribe. It's got a pop-up on the website. You'll then get an email, even if you can't make the live stream, and you'll get a discount code to be able to go back and watch it and get that. But we get incredible feedback. It is a great value, which is why I'm so excited about our digital courses, because one-on-one inevitably is just a bigger commitment. But the courses, you're getting a lot of material, and it's myself with 3 other real survivors from different backgrounds. And so there's like teaching, equipping, but there's also just like real life dialogue. Like, I mean, we're having genuine conversation that's been recorded. So different people for you to connect with and like different voices for you to tune into. And yeah, it's all done in the privacy of your own home. So you have complete confidentiality. So yeah, that's coming out again. So that's the main thing I'd probably want to bring to people's attention. But BeEmboldened.com to see whatever it is we've got going on, and plug in wherever it's going to be helpful to you.